Hi, I'm Tom Harper.
And I'm Georgina Brown.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show,
a podcast inspired by the life and legacy of the legendary adventure writer Wilbur Smith, and about how a taste of adventure can help you think differently about your life.
So this episode is the second of our three special features in which Georgina and I are joined by the authors shortlisted for the 2024 Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize. The prize happens every year and it's open to writers of any nationality writing historical fiction in English, with different awards for published, unpublished, and young writers. Now, like most of us writers, Wilbur Smith had an absolutely fearsome appetite for reading both the books by the authors he loved and that thrill that we all get from discovering new authors. So the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize is very much about readers as much as it is about writers. Every book on the shortlist is handpicked by librarians and library staff, and every year it provides a really diverse shortlist that stretches the definitions of adventure to give an adventure for everyone. So I can guarantee you that whatever you are into, there will be a book on the shortlist for you. There'll probably be 6 books on the shortlist for you, quite frankly, because they're all amazing.
And everyone's tastes do vary as readers, and today's books are very different. Their authors, well, we'll see. We're joined by Louis de Bernières, author of Light over Liskeard, and Derek.B Miller, author of The Curse of Pietro Houdini, to talk World War II, technology, getting back to nature, and much more.
So, by way of introduction, Derek.B Miller is an American novelist and international affairs professional, which I always think sounds slightly sinister. Author of 6 highly acclaimed novels, including Norwegian by Night, which won the CWA John Creasy Dagger Award, and How to Find Your Way in the Dark, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. He describes himself as a windmill jouster, a mediocre guitar player, a decent cook, an avid motorcycle rider, and an enthusiastic father with aspirations for greatness, which is certainly something I can identify with.
And Louis de Bernières is a novelist, a musician, a poet. He's the best-selling author of Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize Best Book in 1995, and many more novels, short story collections, and children's books. He's been a landscape gardener, a motorcycle messenger, a philosophy tutor, a teacher, and seems like the kind of person who could never be bored. Welcome, Louis. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you.
So to kick off, for listeners who've not yet had the pleasure of reading your books, we're wondering if you could perhaps just say a few words about the books that you've been shortlisted for. So maybe Louis first with Light over Liskeard.
This is the first book I've ever tried to set in the future, well, that's been published anyway. I read an article in The Week magazine some time ago about quantum cryptography, about how the new breed of computers might be able to crack any codes almost instantly, whereas it would have taken months or years before. And when I read this, I thought, oh my God, we're stuffed, because everything in our civilization is controlled by electronic codes. If they're instantly crackable, and say someone like Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin gets hold of a quantum computer, then basically the grid gets turned off, doesn't it? And we're back in 1900. Sorry, 1800. So I have a character who's a quantum cryptographer, and he sees this coming. He's trying to. He writes letters to the Prime Minister to warn her, and he buys a ruined house on Bodmin Moor, where he and his family can be safe when the fan stops whirring. So. And the novel is really about the relationships that he strikes up on the moor and the way of life that he adopts once he's there. And it's full of references to things which I think are going to happen or already happening, such as, rewilding.
And Derek, will come to you as well. If you could just tell us a little bit more about The Curse of Pietro Houdini, then we'll dig in a bit more into each of your books.
So The Curse of Pietro Houdini it's a war novel, it's an art heist, it's a coming-of-age novel, and obviously an adventure novel. Let's make sure we mention that. But it is It's a story that evolved in a slightly strange way for me, because it's mainly set at the Abbey of Monte Cassino, which is above Cassino in Italy, south of Rome, in the Liri Valley. And I had written prior to this. I'll just do this briefly, but prior to this, I had written a rather epic sci-fi novel called Radio Life, and which was partly in dialogue or conversation with this rather famous science fiction book from much, much earlier. I think it was 1959, called Canticle for Leibowitz. And Walter Miller Jr. was a bomber, he flew over 50 missions during World War II, and he was one of the men who helped destroy the Abbey of Monte Cassino in 1944. And that his story and the story of Abbey of Monte Cassino stayed with me, and so I started digging into it. And so this novel came about from just an impulse to look into that story and finding something extraordinarily along the way that really changed my understanding of the war, and also how we remember things, because everybody's heard of D-Day, but almost nobody really knows about the Battle of Monte Cassino, which had 55,000 casualties, Allied casualties. By which I mean I got through much of my education without really any serious discussion about it. I have a doctorate in international relations, so you'd think it would come up. So this was my dive into that universe, and then the riches that I found, and then turning that into drama, which I hope you all enjoy.
Yeah, very much.
Enjoyed it greatly, but we've enjoyed both of your books greatly. It's fantastic to hear a little bit more about the stories that inspired the novels. But Louis, I wanted to ask you about the time and place. You've already told us that Light Over Liskeard is set in the future, and you don't tell us exactly when in the future. How far do you imagine?
I wanted to leave it vague so that I wouldn't be caught out by any pedants.
Very wise.
But as I say, it's a lot of it is really, a lot of it is things which you can see coming. So I'm thinking maybe 20, 30 years time.
That's not far away at all.
You can already buy sex bots in Japan, for example. I can't afford one yet.
I did hear about a restaurant in London that has a robot server. So that's happening too.
Is that happening already?
Apparently so.
God, how depressing.
Your 2030 just shrank to 8 or 6.
Yeah, worrying. And why Bodmin Moor? Why Cornwall? Because a lot of the action happens between there and a little bit in London, but mostly Cornwall.
One reason is that I love Bodmin. I did the Bodmin Poetry Festival many years ago and took a walk on it in my spare time. And there are still lots of Stone Age remains there, standing stones. It's strongly connected with the legends of King Arthur. King Arthur's sword was thrown into Dosmary Pool, and one of my characters is waiting for that sword to come back out. But I needed somewhere that was very, very remote from any large centres of population, because my protagonist has a theory that when the grid goes down and all the shops have been looted and everybody has looted each other's houses, the towns will have to empty out into the countryside as a desperate population departs in search of food. And he calls it the Horde. And he wants somewhere that's a long way from any large central population, so that he and his family will be safe from the Horde. These desperate, starving people. Bodmin seems as good a place as any.
Yeah.
When you think with their driverless cars, or even us today, how long it can often take to get down to Cornwall.
Well, as I've discovered to my cost, my son has just started at Falmouth University, and it takes me 9 hours to get there from East Anglia, if you include the breaks. When you get to the other end, you can hardly walk.
So when the grid goes down and they're walking all the way, that's going to be much more than 9 hours.
Yeah, you've thought this through. It's funny, obviously the shortlist is chosen by librarians, then even the pairings for this podcast are sort of thrown together by the vagaries of scheduling and when we can get different people together. But I'm struck that sort of the trajectories of your kind of writing journeys, that Louis, you're sort of celebrated for having written Captain Corelli's Mandolin about Italian soldiers in World War II. And you've now gone to a sort of dystopian future. Derek, you wrote the novel about the dystopian future, and you've now gone back to write about Italians in World War II. I guess you'd fixed on Monte Cassino, I think you said, as the subject of the novel, and that inevitably takes you to 1944. Was there anything about doing that sort of historical novel, the research, that intimidated you?
I don't think intimidation is the right word for me. I think it's more of, keep in mind, I'm coming to fiction also from a slightly different place. In other words, I worked at the UN for over a decade. I worked on post-conflict reconstruction. I worked on the reintegration of ex-combatants in civil wars, weapons collection programs, things that if you screw up, people die. So, the worst that happens here is you blow 12 quid. So it's not, now that doesn't mean to say, though, that it's not very, very important, because I'm also quite convinced that most people get their history from drama. That is to say, television, movies, novels, and whatnot. And so while there are no rules about this, there are no laws about this, I think every writer, and Louis and I, we've never met, but I have read some of your books, and I feel that you and I share a strong inclination to get it right, because we feel a certain burden of responsibility. Not to speak for you, of course, but I think that there's clearly a seriousness of mind when it comes to detail and factuality, from which the drama either can emerge if you're inspired by it, or at least you're in, as the writer, in dialogue with the facts, the reality of that universe, to try to make sure that what it is people are learning, they can differentiate the fiction bit from the nonfiction bit, right? I mean, there is no Pietro Houdini wandering the halls of the Abbey, but there was a war. So, and I'm an academic by training, and what that means is that delving into unfamiliar stuff, looking for patterns, reconnoitering, learning what's relevant, pulling out, what is the essential timeline, the arc, the main events, what can be bent but shouldn't be broken, etc., is all reasonably familiar. The harder part, the more daunting part, at any event, is coming up with a story, not a dissertation, right? And the story part is a living heart, the pulse of the thing, and it's in the story doesn't present itself first, a bit like a historian, and I do properly mean a historian, is at first you have an inkling that you want to study something, and so you reconnoiter, right? You wander around in the archive, either literally or metaphorically, and you just start reading a lot, and so then something begins to, you feel a disturbance in the force. Either there's a gap you want to fill, or there's an error you want to correct, or and then that's where you'll make your mark. In this case, you're waiting for a kind of artistic inspiration to come along, and suddenly when you understand what your story is, then all the stuff that you've learned begins to have something around which to gather, and then you're off to the races. And so I think that was and that's where the fun is.
For I was just going to say, for
I'll raise my hand.
We leave a nice pause there, don't we? For listeners, I could see Louis nodding his head during that conversation. Louis, do you?
Yes, he said stuff which I would totally agree with. It's all very well knowing the big general picture, where, for example, you find out that there were 50,000 casualties. But if you want to turn that into drama or fiction, if you want to make it real for readers, then you need to have the anecdotes of one or two or three people who were casualties or who were involved in it. I've always been a great fan of the big history books, but when I'm doing research, what I'm doing is mostly collecting anecdotes, or indeed making them up, because those anecdotes are what are going to bring the history alive. As Derek says, the last thing you want to do is actually deliver a dissertation.
Right.
You've got to help people to learn all that history without them even realizing they're learning it.
Definitely.
Which is a power, right? Which because you are in effect teaching them by through this story, and so then you have to figure out as a writer what sense of responsibility you have and what you're going to do with that. And it isn't there again. There are no rules on it, but I think that by the time, this is my 7th novel. Louis's been at this since 1990. Or assuming you wrote the book before you published it, I'm assuming that you've been at it longer than that, right? So, and so you eventually, your readers, I think, come to understand that when they go to one of your novels, that you're going to be maintaining a consistency in your approach to writing. That is to say, I'm not going to go off the rails on one, whereas I'm going to be holding on rigidly to another. So, but different kinds of writers, you're going to get different kinds of stuff.
How did you find that process, Louis, when writing Light Over Liskeard, in terms of writing about the future rather than something historical? Did you go about your research in a similar way?
My research, the research I mainly had to do actually was to make absolutely sure that I did understand quantum mechanics.
No pressure.
And go from there to working out how to put this over to the reader without it actually becoming either science fiction or a really turgid and impossible lecture on this very difficult subject. So I concentrated mainly on what the sort of practical consequences of quantum theory are, which anybody can understand without even knowing how to do an equation. So if I tell you that something can be in 2 different states at the same time, depending on how you observe it, that's scientific realism. That's waves and particles, But if you think about it, it's also magic realism. So I've got a character who is simultaneously 3 characters. Well, why not? The scientists tell me that superposition is possible and that it happens all the time. But apart from that, the research was practical things. A lot of. For example, I already know how to skin a rabbit. I'm a countryman. All that stuff about how to survive on the moor is something that I could do myself. So in a way, I've researched that just by being the person I am and having lived this long.
And Derek, obviously Monte Cassino was famously bombed to smithereens by the Americans. Spoiler alert for anyone who's not read the book. But then I think rebuilt after the war. Did you get to go there and visit it?
No, I haven't been yet, which is rather nuts. And I was in contact with a lot of different monasteries, but Monte Cassino they didn't write me back. They didn't realize just how much fun this would be. But monks, what are you going to do? It was rebuilt in 1964. Which sounds like just a statistic. Oh, they built a building in 1964. But what's really nuts about it is that there would be a whole nonfiction book to write about this, but there's the plan, because they started building it in 529 AD on the ruins of the Temple of Apollo. Yeah. Which Christians were wont to do at the time, which was to squash the Hellenistic and venture forth with Christianity, and the Greeks really know how to pick some great spots, great views, very majestic over the valley, some strategic whatnot. But in 1964, it's shocking that basically 20 years after the war, that the Italians were able to take the original plans and put this thing back together. And it's because you need to see it to realize just how extraordinary a structure it is, and how much talent that one wonders. there's an answer to it, but I don't know the answer of where it is they found the stone cutters. Where did they find the marble workers? Where did they find the people who knew how to work with gold leaf, and on and on and on. I was watching some episode of Top Gear at one point where they were explaining how the Brits they opted for whatever reason to put together an old locomotive engine, and how it's missing this nut and this lug and this whatever, and how they had to go to some guy in Leeds who had a basement, whose grandfather once knew how to do this, and he had to cast the thing, and and you're thinking, this is a choo-choo train. And it's Great Britain, and it's now. And this was Italy, with Italians who aren't necessarily as equally motivated, and they put this thing together such a short time later. I find it staggering, and just the act of that to be something that's probably worthy of a tour. I'm just not qualified to do it.
They probably found all those people in Greece.
In where?
Greece.
Yeah, maybe. You're not kidding. With nothing to do. Nothing.
Yeah. I'm struck that in both your novels, they are kind of about people retreating from the world in different ways, because the world is becoming a scary place, either to Bodmin Moor or to the Abbey. And I was wondering, I guess, for both of you, maybe for Louis first, is there a sense of something in this moment that makes writing about retreating from the world attractive?
Yes, to me anyway. I'm becoming increasingly alarmed by our absolute or sort of abject dependence on technology. There's a famous passage in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit where he says that the master always ends up as the slave of the slave. And that's because you become dependent on the slave and can't do without it. And I feel we're getting like that with all our miracles and wonders. Just what we're doing at the moment, for example, is if you think about it, a technological miracle. But I think we've become so dependent on all these things that the moment anything goes drastically wrong with any of it, we'll be absolutely helpless. And so I sort of think, well, we actually still do have to be told how to snare a rabbit.
Do you think if we were to experience what you imagine happening in Light Over Liskeard, a future grid failure, could you make a life? Do you think you'd be ready for it with the skills that you need?
Well, yes, I'm ready for it. But the trouble is almost everyone else I know isn't. And they'd all be turning up here for me to look after them.
Yeah, so my children mock me because I refuse to use Google Maps because I think it enslaves us to technology. But that's still quite a long way down from being able to snare a rabbit.
Yeah, but Louis, the trick is, Louis, you not just to know what you're doing, but have a good communication campaign. So you got to put up some signs that say things like "good stuff that away," and, head them up towards Manchester or something. Oh, okay.
Misdirection.
There's an army surplus place near me with a huge sign that says "Beware, firing range." And I was wondering if they'd sell that to me.
That's a good starting point.
Yeah, actually, there's some in Pusey where you can get where they have an artillery range there, and so you have the tank crossings and other sorts of explosive ordnance and the rest of it. So there might be some you can repurpose.
I can see that preppers are going to be listening.
At the moment, all I've got is a little iron plate that says "Beware of the teenager," and another one says that "Beware of the cat," and another one says "Never mind the dog, beware of the owner."
I don't know which is most dangerous.
Teenager.
No question.
Whoever had the sense of humor to put it up, that's what you're all missing. That's the scary part. That's the mind behind the plan.
Derek, do you think you could survive?
I think the first thing I would need would be friends. And I also probably wouldn't put myself on the most populated island in the world, even if it's in a charming locale. So, I think I'd have to figure out what the basic, because I'm not trying to survive myself. I'd be trying to keep the kids going. But there's a lot to deal with in that your basic post-apocalyptic scenario. And but you're gonna need friends, and you're gonna need a plan.
Hey, this is Tom. If Louis de Bernières has got you thinking about how you'd survive in a harsh place without modern technology, why not take a listen to episode 30 of That Wilbur Smith Show?
Tom spoke to Australian author Peter Watt about his acclaimed novels of people surviving unimaginable hardships in the unforgiving landscape of the Australian outback.
Or for a more modern take on the outback, in episode 21, we spoke to last year's prize winner Emma Stiles about her phenomenal novel, No Country for Girls. Check it out.
Derek, you mentioned friends and needing friends, and that's one of the things in Light Over Liskeard.
Yes, please.
We all need friends. In Light Over Liskeard, Louis Q. Artie, when he gets to Cornwall, he meets Theo, and Theo is his next door neighbour and becomes one of his best friends, his teacher, many things to him. Theo is from the Andes. And in fact, the Andes are featured heavily in quite a few of your books. What brings you back to the Andes once again?
Oh, well, when I was writing Birds Without Wings, which is the big novel after Captain Corelli, I realised that a character in Captain Corelli could have come from Turkey with the original migration of, the population exchange where the Christians were exchanged for Greek Muslims. And I thought, I can have this character from in Captain Corelli coming from Turkey. So I tied the two books together. And ever since then, I've been tying my books together so that if anyone, after I'm dead, reads my entire oeuvre, they will realise I've written one huge novel.
That's wonderful.
That's the motive.
The Bernières cinematic universe.
Yes, I like the way that my books loop into each other. So there's a character called Rosa, who turns up in a book which isn't really hers. I just find it. It's a fun thing to do. I mean, writing has to be fun, and you have to play subtle tricks on the reader and hope that maybe they'll notice it in 20 years' time. It's like putting a book in your little girl's bedroom, which you hope she's going to read when she's 26. Little time bombs. I like putting time bombs in, which people will only notice later on.
Well, let me ask. You guys asked if I could, if we might ask a few questions. I want to just follow this up and ask Louis a question. Louis, you've been at this a while now, right? And leaving the novel you just wrote aside for a second, what do you think can still only be found in novels, if anything? I mean, which might be a sneaky way of saying, why should people still be reading novels?
Well, I once heard Mario Vargas Llosa say that the most wonderful thing about writing was that you could have adventures that you never would have had otherwise, and that's true of the writer. As you know, you enter into a sort of alternative universe where you exist for much of your time. It's like having an extra life tacked onto your real one, and I think that it's the same for readers. That an avid reader who's read 1,000 books, 1,000 novels in their lifetime has sort of lived 1,000 lives.
Let me follow that up. I agree with you, of course, but what if I didn't and I said sure, but somebody who's binge watched 1,000 series on Netflix, haven't they done the same thing?
No, they haven't, because the experience isn't really theirs, because the sound and the pictures have been provided for them. With a reader, you make your own movie.
So the answer then is that there's still something distinct, unique, and valuable to the novel that still isn't found in another form, you think?
Yeah, because you're making your own movie. It's much less passive.
And last point, if I'm going to push it even further, so what? Why is that valuable? Why does that matter? Okay, yeah, it's true, but lots of things are true.
It's difficult to bring any kind of scientific proof into things which are just about a matter of quality, isn't it? My feeling is, and I can't prove it, is that your quality of life is simply better in that way. I think the quality of your experience is better when you have to contribute something to it yourself. But I can't prove it. What do you think?
No, I agree with you, and I don't think I have to prove it. I think I have to put forward a convincing argument, and I win when somebody picks up the book. I think that's how that game works. Um, but I think that there is, I think that in being your, sorry, when the reader encounters something and they become the co-creator of the experience by filling in everything you and I as writers don't say. If we say that there's a vase of flowers on a table in the sunlight, we haven't told them the color of the vase, the color of the flowers, the intensity of the sunlight, the angle it's coming in, the wind, etc. Right? And so whatever we're not giving them, they're providing themselves. And it constitutes a creative act. And I think it brings the whole mind into the experience in a way that passively receiving Breaking Bad or Moana 2 doesn't do. That isn't to say I don't like watching movies and seeing television and stuff, but there is something inherently lost. And I think if I'm going to answer the other bit about my own question is also that I'm still convinced that the novel, and I don't mean the TV series, remains the most sophisticated and complex model of human interaction that we have yet devised. That is to say that the military models wargaming in order to be able to prepare for what might potentially be the future. They don't get it all right. They have to make assumptions. Things are left out, but it's as close as they can get to the experience so that they're not caught off guard. The Economist models actual interactions and social scientists do the same to get as close as reasonably possible to understanding some phenomenon under investigation. But I don't think any model in any field comes close to getting to the nuanced sophistication, mutability, and creativity of the novel, which I just don't, and I don't see it being replaced by anything else, which I also think is why they're feeding these things into AI right now, not the other stuff. Because if you want to figure out how humans live, this seems to be where you get your data. And I don't see that ending because I don't see anything else coming up trying to replace it.
No, I think the only area where a movie can compete with a novel is in creating empathy. You know, you can
Yeah.
a good movie can make you weep in the same way that a good novel can, but I think that's the only way in which it can really compete at all.
No, I agree. And because music is emotive and we don't have any, and that sucks. And so they win. And also, good actors can expand you. I mean, unfortunately, you can only bring to a book as a reader what you might have available to you in your own resources, whereas you watch a great actor and they might be able to expand the limits of what you're capable of feeling. And so that collaboration within that medium has, but all I'm saying here really is that there is obviously value to film and whatnot. But the question remains, are we writers, are we going to be eclipsed, and is the novel done and has it been replaced? And I'm still not convinced it has. I still think there's,
Sorry, people have been talking about the death of the novel for absolutely decades,
right,
and there's absolutely no sign of it.
right. I think a lot of publishers are still acquiring books. There's no differential now between whether they pay 10,000 quid for a book or they pay, 150,000 quid or £1 million for a book, between the actual sales they're getting, meaning that they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what to do anymore to sell books. And what that also means is that if they're just buying stuff for as cheap as possible and throwing it into the world, and now it's possible for writers to act as cheaply as possible and throw things into the world. My worry is that the world is going to become flooded with nonsense. And I don't know how people who are truly worthy of attending to, good writers, as it were, good storytellers, are going to be found as time goes on. And I think it's going to become harder and harder for younger people who have true talent to be recognized. And I don't know where this is going.
I mean, I think the one way is going to be, of course, if people look at the book shortlisted for the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize, they were guaranteed to find quality authors and good reads.
Of course, that is correct. That is the correct answer.
I want to pick up on something that Louis said about writing books allowing you, the author, to go on an adventure that otherwise you'd never have had in real life. Because adventure, obviously, is the key word for our prize and for our podcast. And Derek, you mentioned a bit earlier that your book was many things. And adventure was sort of appended to the list, possibly when you found out you'd been shortlisted for the prize. But for both of you, but maybe for Louis first, did you have a sense that this was an adventure story? Were you surprised to be in the adventure writing category?
I was extremely surprised, but only for a short time, because I quickly realised that actually what I've written in Light Over Liskeard is in many ways an adventure story. It begins in the classic manner with a messenger arriving with a statement, with a mission statement. You know, the Artie doesn't want to do it, and then he does do it, and then a mentor turns up in the form of Theo. This is all classic adventure story structure, which you'll find in Lord of the Rings, for example.
Right.
Mm.
I did it on purpose because I have from time to time taught creative writing, and I've talked about the hero's journey. I've taught that lots of times, and I thought it's about time I did this myself. So it, that's why I had the messenger arriving and the mentor and the various crises and so on. So I had written an adventure story, but without actually thinking that it was at the time. But I mean, the other way in which it's an adventure story is that with any kind of research that you do, you are on a personal, geographical, historical, and intellectual adventure. So, for example, I once spent 2 weeks on the battlefield at Gallipoli to work out what it must have been like to be involved in that campaign in 1915. I've travelled all over Turkey collecting stories. I've been to Sri Lanka several times because I had part of a trilogy set there, and I went up into the tea growing area. And these, looking back on it, well, I thought of them as research, but I mean, now I think, now that this prize is hove into view, I'm thinking, well, actually, my life, I've had some pretty good adventure stories myself.
Yeah.
I think you have.
Yeah. Hi, this is Tom. If you'd like to find out more about the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize, you can follow them on Instagram at Adventure Writing Prize. They share opportunities to get involved, book recommendations, author interviews, and stories of inspiring adventurers. It's a place for readers, writers, and listeners alike. Check it out.
When the shortlists are selected for the prize, we work with librarians who are volunteers from across the UK who read all of the books that are submitted, and we gather and we fight it out to get down to the shortlist. And the conversations around what adventure actually is and challenging the perceptions of what people think it might be are so divisive. But that's one of the things we want to do with this shortlist, is to present books that will open doors into new places, that will make people feel different things, overcome obstacles, all things which I think both of your books do. Derek, would you have considered yourself an adventure writer or thought of The Curse of Pietro Dini as an adventure novel?
I think I've been trying to figure out, and I would love to have been privy to those conversations about what is adventure, right? Because I think it's interesting. And when we try to find the parameter, well, two things. When we find the core definition of a genre and then try to figure out what its parameters are also, it lends itself to very interesting investigation into, what differentiates it from something else in human life. But so the one thing that I was coming up with that was making me think, and I shouldn't say this, but I'll go with no for a second, was, to me, going but with Louis' example of the Lord of the Rings, or let's just do The Hobbit is actually better in this case, is I think it's about choice. In other words, to me, at least in my own usage of the term, an adventure is a choice. Bilbo is reluctant, but but then he chooses to follow Gandalf. And then, so there's an active decision. Okay, yes, everybody shows up at his house and they eat his food and all the rest of it. But eventually he comes around, as the British do, and he goes and saves the universe, reluctantly and without any too much fuss. And then, but you can also have, like leadership, right? Adventure thrust upon you. And so then I'm sort of wondering, what does that mean? And we're not going to solve it in just the few minutes we have. But the only reason I would have said no was because I feel that my characters in this book didn't so much elect an adventure. They elected to go get something done in the midst of danger. And is it adventurous? Yes, by definition. But is it necessarily the driving force of choosing an act of wonder, an act of, it's not climbing the big mountain, Everest, because it's there. I know it's a misquote, but I like it anyway. And so it's, so I don't know, but I think the fact that I'm wondering about it and mulling about it is fun. And I definitely say that if an adventure has something to do with just a series of extraordinary events, each one, thrusting your character into a new and unexpected thing, basically the Odyssey, right? Although Odysseus wanted to go home, he chose to go home and not stay with Calypso, right? So questionable choice, but off he went. And so that is to me an adventure, right? Whereas the Iliad, not so much, right? That's everybody's sort of stuck, kind of attacking Ilion. So I'm still wondering about it, but I love it. And just one last thing, Tom, I know you were being a little facetious and making a low-hanging fruit joke, but it wasn't actually that much of a joke. I mean, the thing is, as we need to sort out the wheat from the chaff, we need authoritative voices. We need people who have judgment and reason. We need people who are real audiences, sincere, loving, passionate audiences of art forms to help elevate the best to the attention of the public, whether it is opera or haikus or rap music or novels or whatever it is, because without those, they're not gatekeepers. They're the people with the deepest passionate love. And I just end on this. There was one point at La Scala where apparently Pavarotti, his voice broke just a little bit, and the entire audience started booing him. Boo! They just, so none of this, no, because they're there, their standards are here, they're busy people, they know what the best is, and they're demanding it. Whereas everybody in, Kennedy Center would have been like, oh, that's okay, that sort of thing happens, right? And I love the fact that they booed him. Number one, he needs to be knocked down a little bit because, he's not a god. The second thing is, you need the audience that knows what they're hearing and loves. And I think prizes like this, therefore, are essential. It's not really about which of the 6 of us or 20 of us or whatever wins, at least not for the reader. It's elevating these books to the attention of the readers. So now, out of the 18,000, we now have something that we can attend to and wonder about and whatever. And I think it's wonderful. So more of this.
Very articulately put. Thank you.
And probably on that note, as good a note as any to end it on, with a celebration of the prize and, of course, the writers who are on that prize. But most of all, as we started off by saying, this prize is ultimately about the readers and giving readers fantastic stories, fantastic adventurous stories. So which they will certainly find in your 2 books and the other books on the shortlist. So thank you both so much for joining us. It's been an absolute delight talking to you.
Thank you. Nice meeting you guys.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Louis.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, we will be back for the next episode with the final 2 of the prize shortlist. But until then, it's goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
And goodbye from me, Georgina Brown.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer Niso Smith.